On December 25, 1991, the Soviet flag came down from the Kremlin for the final time. Most people remember it as a political moment, a system collapsing, an era ending, a global rivalry concluding. But if you had been staring at the numbers inside the Soviet finance apparatus, you would have seen something else. A state that could no longer pay its bills. Not defeated by an invading army. Not toppled overnight by a single protest. Crushed by a balance sheet that stopped balancing. This is the story of a superpower that could maintain an enormous nuclear arsenal and still struggle to keep basic goods moving through stores. It's a story about what happens when a country ties its stability to one commodity, and that commodity suddenly stops delivering. To understand how the Soviet Union ran out of road, we have to go back to the moment it started believing it had found an economic shortcut. The year is 1965. In the harsh expanse of Western Siberia, Soviet geologists strike a discovery that will reshape the next decades, a massive oil reserve widely associated with the Samodolo region. To Soviet planners, it looks like salvation. The economy is already showing strain. Consumer goods are scarce and uncompetitive. Productivity is lagging, but oil doesn't require factories to innovate, or farms to become efficient. Oil only requires drilling, pipelines, and export contracts. Then the 1970s arrive, and global oil prices surge after geopolitical shocks. The Soviet Union becomes one of the biggest winners. Hard currency, money that actually works outside the ruble zone, flows into Moscow. The leadership is suddenly able to buy what the system can't produce: grain, machines, technology, and calm. But easy revenue has a hidden cost. When money arrives without reform, reform gets postponed. Why overhaul inefficient factories when exports keep funding imports? Why fix agriculture when you can purchase food abroad? The result is an economy that leans harder on raw materials and falls further behind in producing the kinds of goods the world wants to pay for. That oil income also becomes political glue. The state keeps bread and staples artificially cheap. It sustains housing support. It props up allies and satellite economies. It bankrolls a giant military establishment. For a time, it looks like strength. In reality, it's stability built on a single variable: the price of a barrel. As long as the price stays high, the system can hide its internal decay. But once the price drops, everything that was covered up becomes visible at once. By the early 1980s, the environment shifts. Western economies grow more energy efficient. New supplies come online in places like the North Sea and Alaska. The oil market becomes less predictable. The price starts to wobble. And there's another pressure that's often ignored in popular retellings: Soviet agriculture. The USSR has extraordinary farmland, especially in places like Ukraine. Yet the collective farm system produces stunning inefficiency. Enormous amounts of food are lost before reaching consumers. The state repeatedly finds itself forced to import grain in huge quantities. Here's the trap: grain imports require hard currency. The ruble can't buy American wheat or European equipment. The USSR needs dollars, marks, or gold. So the cycle deepens. Export oil for hard currency, then spend that hard currency to purchase food and industrial inputs. It works until it doesn't. Now, the timeline tightens. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev takes power. He sees stagnation and launches reforms, perestroika, hoping to modernize industry and revive growth. But modernization requires funding. He looks at the budget and assumes energy revenue will carry the load. Then comes the shock. In the mid-1980s, Saudi policy shifts toward higher production. The market floods. Prices tumble. What was expensive oil becomes cheap oil, and a budget designed for high prices suddenly faces a crater. For the Soviet system, this is not a minor downturn. It's an income collapse colliding with fixed obligations. Military spending remains massive. The Afghanistan war continues draining resources. Allies still expect support. Grain imports still need payment. And the consumer economy is already brittle. Gorbachev has choices, and none are painless. Cut the military, and you fight the security establishment. Cut subsidies, and you risk unrest. Or borrow, and you delay the crash. So the borrowing begins. Western banks lend heavily. On paper, it seems safe. This is a nuclear superpower with assets, territory, and the appearance of permanence. But much of this money isn't used to create productive capacity that will pay itself back. It's used to keep the system breathing. Buy food, buy consumer goods, keep shelves from turning into political disasters. Then a domestic policy adds fuel to the fire. Gorbachev launches an anti-alcohol campaign. The intention is social and public health driven. Economically, it slashes a major revenue stream. Alcohol taxes have been one of the state's most dependable sources of income. Restrict sales, and you don't just reduce drinking, you reduce state cash. Meanwhile, people adapt through home production and informal markets, which means the state loses revenue without eliminating consumption. By the late 1980s, the deficit worsens. The government leans into the one tool that always looks tempting in the moment: printing money. But printing money doesn't create goods. It creates paper claims on goods. If the stores are empty, more rubles only produce more frustration. People accumulate cash they can't spend. Shortages intensify. Lines become a daily feature of life. Citizens join queues without knowing what's being sold, because tomorrow it might be gone. This is where economics becomes politics. For years, many Soviet citizens accept limited freedom in exchange for basic security: stable prices, predictable access to essentials, and a guaranteed floor under daily life. When the shelves go bare and the currency loses meaning, that bargain collapses. Meanwhile, creditors begin noticing patterns they don't like. New loans begin covering old obligations. Confidence weakens, the Soviet external position deteriorates. By 1989, the political map changes fast. Eastern European states break away. From one angle, it's liberation. From another, it's an economic rupture. The old trade arrangements fracture. Demands shift toward payments in hard currency. The old system's internal trading logic stops working. Inside the Soviet center, panic grows. Gold reserves shrink as the state sells precious assets to meet immediate needs. The government tries to keep imports moving and obligations paid, but the cushion is disappearing. Then a final internal blow lands: the war of laws. Soviet republics, Russia, Ukraine, the Baltics, and others begin asserting control over their own finances. Tax revenue that once flows to the Union Center is withheld. Boris Yeltsin, leading the Russian Republic, pushes for sovereignty and instructs fiscal structures to keep money local. The result is catastrophic for the Union government. The center loses income. It still holds formal authority over key institutions, but it can't reliably fund them. By 1990 and 1991, commercial defaults and payment delays become reality. Suppliers demand hard currency and guarantees. Trust evaporates. The state makes desperate moves, including freezing accounts and pulling resources from enterprises that have earned foreign currency, undermining remaining confidence. As trust collapses, the ruble stops functioning as a true medium of exchange. The economy drifts toward barter and informal trade. Goods become money. People get paid in whatever their factory produces, and then try to swap it for food. The dollar and other hard currencies become the real standard in everyday life for anyone who can access them. In August 1991, hardliners attempt a coup. Tanks appear, declarations are made, and the old guard tries to reverse momentum. But the coup has no real solution to the underlying collapse: debt, shortages, empty state coffers, and a currency crisis. Force can seize buildings, it can't refill a budget. After the coup fails, the center returns weaker. Power continues shifting toward Republican leaders. The Union exists increasingly as paperwork without functioning finances. Western governments and lenders face a new fear. If the Soviet Union breaks apart, who inherits the debt? Negotiations intensify. Eventually, a zero-option arrangement emerges. Russia assumes the Soviet external debt in exchange for claims on foreign assets and international continuity. The Soviet Union ends, but the accounting doesn't. The new Russian Federation inherits obligations that shaped the 1990s. Painful reforms, brutal price liberalization, collapsing savings, and a society absorbing the shock without a financial cushion. Later crises follow, including another major default in 1998. Over time, rising commodity prices and restructuring help close the chapter. Years later, Russia settles remaining Soviet-era obligations, finishing the long tail of the empire's debt. The lesson is not that resources are worthless. The lesson is that resources are not the same thing as a modern, resilient economy. When easy money replaces reform, structural weaknesses grow quietly. When the price screen turns against you, the hidden weaknesses surface all at once. The state can have missiles, intelligence services, and slogans, yet still fail if it cannot fund the basics that keep society stable. Empires don't only fall on battlefields. Sometimes they fall quietly when ordinary people stop trusting tomorrow. And that's the moment the ledger outvotes the ideology. Chronofinance, following the money through time.